Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. This one is a little bit late. I've been kind of busy, but I finally got around to actually making it, so let's just get into it. As a heads up, if you haven't had a chance to look at the character in any way yet, it seems to me like the character is more oriented towards PvP because of the low cooldown on the iframe ignore and long iframes on his other skills, as well as the fact that he has additional damage versus supervillain characters. On the PvE side, he doesn't seem to be as great because a lot of his skills can't be cancelled on top of one another, and from what I've seen online and my own testing, it seems the character is likely more in line with how Ghost Rider plays, or probably a little bit behind him, so just take that into consideration when you're building the character. But obviously you'll see the testing and can decide for yourself. The very first test I did was to take him into a stage 99 of Thanos at T2 only, just to see if his uniform alone could deal enough damage to win the fight. Keep in mind that all the testing that you see is with no damage proc. I'm simply using an obelisk or a CTP of regen for the most part, and I don't have his artifact either. You saw in that previous clip I was able to complete stage 99 with about 1 minute and 15 seconds remaining, and in this one, because this boss is susceptible to fire resist down, which Robbie Reyes has on his 5th skill, but he doesn't have all defense down, that's still enough to be able to complete this stage about 2 minutes faster than the Thanos stage. If you get a chance to awaken the character, the stat bump that he gets is kind of average. I'd say it's a little bit below average. In terms of the damage, it's pretty good, but for a universal type, it's a little bit uncharacteristic for him to have such low health, which is about 24,000, I believe, base health when you take him to the transcended level. You can see in this clip I get about a 9,000 energy damage boost and only about close to a 14,000 HP boost, which for most other universal characters would be either 16 to 18 or possibly even 20,000. After getting access to the awakening and the stat bump from the transcendence, I'm able to improve the clear time for the Thanos stage by about 1 minute. Unfortunately, the awakening skill doesn't really give him the all defense down that he's missing in his base kit, so that's probably why you don't see a bigger improvement in the clear times, but it does allow him to go past the cap for crit damage. And on this Call Obsidian stage, I'm able to clear it about 30 seconds faster, since the clear time was already pretty decent anyway. If you want to build the character specifically for PvE, you basically just have two options. You can either go a CTP of Rage, because he does have guaranteed crit, or you can go a CTP of Judgment, since he is all element damage across his 5 skills and his awakening. Most likely people will probably go for the CTP of Judgment, since it can be reforged, and I wouldn't really advise going for something like an energy or a destruction, considering that he already has penetration on his 4th skill, and also because, again, his skills can't really be cancelled, and there isn't really one skill that does way more damage than another that you would want to proc on. With no leadership, support, or damage proc, he is able to take down a stage 9 of Null with about 1 minute and 45 seconds remaining roughly. I tried to see how far I could push with that no damage proc, but this time adding a leadership and support, but unfortunately he wasn't really able to do a stage 24 of Null, since I finished with about 10 to 11 bars left. I'm sure that if you use a Judgment or Rage, this performance would change drastically, since you can ride that proc across multiple of his hard hitting skills. But then again, if the character can't do this stage with no proc, it should give you an indication of how far you can push them. Anyways, the rotation that I was using was to do a 3 and then delay cancel it after he throws those chains that are on fire, and you just see them kind of like swirling around. When you see that animation, you go into the 4th skill, let that play out fully till he lands on the ground and the kind of fire animation appears there. Then you go into the 5th skill, and then you just repeat that again. Your 1 and 2 are kind of filler, but most of the times your 3 and 4 will be off cooldown once the 5th ends, because the animation is so long that the 1 and 2 likely won't really be used. Once you've unlocked your awakening skill, you can weave that into the rotation either before or after the 3rd skill. It doesn't really matter too much, but the one that I did was 3 delay cancel, 6 cancel, 4, 5, and then you just repeat the rotation without the awakening skill over again. The reason that you follow this order is because the 3rd skill gives you a damage buff, the fourth skill does good damage and has a long cooldown, so you generally want to use it before the fifth skill, which has a shorter cooldown but also gives you a damage buff. If you go 5 and then 4, you're going to have to be waiting around for that fourth skill to come back off cooldown, which is going to take a while. Whereas if you do the fourth first, the cooldown will start as the skill is running, so you'll have more access to it. Even though the character didn't do that great in World Boss Legend for me, I also took him into ABX and specifically chose characters for the Universal Hero Restriction Day, and I also had to use Thena for the paralysis effect to cancel the Frostbeast's Roar, but I was able to score in the 8 million range with the no damage proc, meaning that he should be able to score probably in the 9 to 10 million range with a full build and a damage proc. My guess is that the character likely won't overtake any of the ABX metas, but you can use him in Squad Battle Vibranium League for the Universal Human restriction, probably either to replace Ghost Rider or to use him in conjunction with Ghost Rider, since Robbie also has that support if you have his artifact. But if I would have to guess, I think that Ghost Rider would still kind of overtake Robbie a little bit because he can cancel so many skills. If you weren't impressed with Robbie's performance in PvE, then his PvP performance you might find a little bit more interesting. The character received a ton of tools in his kit for PvP, including a massive 60% damage increase to supervillain types and a 70% damage decrease from supervillain types. Besides that, one thing that's kind of overlooked by a lot of people is that he also has an 80% chance to be immune to fire damage as well as high fire resistance. So if you're fighting a character like Mephisto, he basically hard counters him because he becomes immune to the fire damage and has that huge damage reduction from the villain character, as well as dealing way more damage to him. Besides this, the character also has that really great iframe ignore on the fourth skill, which has a pretty low cooldown, and also triggers the heal, which is 30% every time the skill activates. But that's not all. The fourth skill also provides a 70% penetration to all sources for 7 seconds, which is really great since having a lot of buff effects on the iframe ignore skill is really good for PvP, since it'll basically activate every time an opponent goes into iframe. And then finally, the last notable thing is that his fifth and fourth skill are full iframes, as well as his 2 and 3 being partial iframes, meaning that if the opponent doesn't have iframe ignore skills, the character will basically completely dominate them because his iframe skills are so long in duration. Regarding the character's AI on auto, it's really good because it opens with the fourth skill, which gives you that 70% penetration to all sources right away, and then it usually goes into the fifth skill, which is also great because it gives you the damage buff, as well as a little bit of that fire resist down versus the opponent. Then it usually goes into the third skill, which again is decent because it gives you another damage buff. Those are the 3 best skills in the character's kit, so it's great that the AI actually cycles through those, especially if you get interrupted, and usually it just sticks between the 4th and 5th skill if you don't get interrupted. And again, if the opponent doesn't have iframe ignore skills, those are full iframes for both of those skills, so the character will take no damage essentially. For build recommendations, I normally wouldn't recommend a CTP of regen on a character that has a little bit lower base health, but because his HP is tied to that iframe ignore skill and he's going to be spamming it all the time, then in this case I would recommend that, especially if you can fork over some Odins to increase his HP a little bit more. But otherwise, stacking at least 8 of those HP Urus should be enough to make that a viable build, especially if you have higher HP on your cards. If you have less than 60 or 50% HP on your cards and don't really want to invest all the Odins or HP Uru on Robbie, then a CTP of Authority would probably be your next best bet, especially if you can reforge it to the Steel effect, since you can get 100% mitigation if you combo it with his uniform passive. His skills do take a little bit of time to deal damage because of the animation length, so if you don't really want to sit around waiting for that, because maybe you're afraid that you're going to get one shot yourself, you could try a CTP of Greed, and that would work pretty well considering that he has native penetration on his 4th skill. All those 3 options are viable, and it really comes down to what you want out of the character, if you want them to be a little bit more tanky, or if you want them to hit a little bit faster versus metas and not risk being one-shot in return. You can see that although he can handle most characters fairly well, that iframe ignore and reflect combo from Emma is a little bit too much for him to handle, especially if it knocks him out of his iframe skill and his iframe ignore skill is on cooldown. One of the first teams that I tested him against in Alliance Conquest was the Black Order, just to see how he could handle them and if he was capable of surviving Corvus's awakening skill. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to do that on solo most of the times that I tried, and it really comes down to RNG on whether his 4th skill, the iframe ignore skill, is off cooldown when Corvus goes into his awakening skill. Regardless, you can see that the character can wipe and beat the whole team no issue, and only loses to Corvus's awakening skill, which he wouldn't if the character wasn't there or if the 4th was off cooldown. You can actually see an example of that here, where Corvus is replaced with Dormammu, but because Robbie has that fire resist and fire immunity, he can handle Dormammu pretty easily. The second part of this fight, even though these characters are not transcended, is to show you that if the character has that 4th skill off cooldown, he can beat the opponent's awakening skill and be able to take them out before they deal damage to take him out. But for a solo, it really comes down to a bit of luck there. This next test showcases how the character performs versus opponents who have very long iframe ignore skills, so that would be characters like Null or possibly Ultron with no artifact or with the artifact, and it also shows you that he is capable of beating Jean Grey, who has a lot of high element resistance, because Robbie just cycles through his 4 and 5, and his 5th skill has element resist down, which means he'll reduce those resistances down to deal enough damage, and because he's cycling constantly through his iframe skills, and Jean doesn't have any iframe ignore skills, he's basically taking no damage while just withering away her health. The obvious benefit of him being awakened is that he can nuke the second team, and even if they are able to survive his awakening skill with you having no damage proc, again, if the opponent doesn't have any iframe ignore skills, he can literally just keep cycling through his 4 and 5 till they're whittled away. One of the things that I mentioned earlier is that the fire resistance and the proc to get fire immunity is often overlooked, but it can actually be really useful for hard countering certain opponents, like Mephisto, and he can actually function pretty well against Wolverine as well, since he is all fire damage with his latest uniform. One of the most common teams that's used in Alliance Conquest is pairing Dormammu with Mephisto because of his fire damage and debuff to villain allies, which is kind of funny because Robbie Reyes has tools in his kit to directly hard counter this team. The character can solo this team pretty consistently by himself, and the only real issue he has versus this team is if the opponent, Mephisto, I would guess, has something like a CTP of Judgment or a proc, or if you end up taking damage from Dormammu's Reflect. Other than that, the character himself pretty much hard counters this team, and if you put other good characters with Robbie, he should be able to win most of the times. So there you have it, that is the breakdown for Robbie Reyes. In my opinion, the character is mostly going to excel at something like Alliance Conquest specifically, not really Timeline since there are better options there, but the uniform could also prove useful in things like Squad Battle and even World Boss Legend if you're pushing to higher stages, since his uniform and kit does offer you a little bit of that passive boost to the fire type characters, especially if you also happen to get his artifact. The character doesn't seem to excel that well in PvE as a solo character, so if you're looking to get him for that reason, you might not be that happy. Let me know what you think about the character in the comments down below, either from the video or from your own testing, since I'm genuinely interested to know what other people's opinion on the character upgrades are. If you did enjoy the video or found it interesting, entertaining, or useful, then please consider liking, subscribing, or sharing it with others, since it might help them out, and in turn it might help me out if they do subscribe, like, and comment or whatever. As always, I appreciate you taking the time to watch these videos, so thank you, but the video is now over.